Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is John Gray, and I have the privilege of being your director of your National Museum of American History. I want to thank everybody for waiting in line today. We do have security requirements, and it's just a state of what we have to do, so I appreciate your patience, and I appreciate the fact you've all come to us tonight. So thank you for joining us for this special symposium, concert, and exhibition preview celebrating the opening of our new exhibition, Religion in Early America. This program is part of our Religion in America initiative, which explores our nation's rich religious history through research, exhibitions, and public events. We are thankful to the Lilly Endowment for their generous support, and we welcome back our renowned friend and scholar, Stephen Prothero, who's been a long-standing supporter of ours and collaborator. Welcome back, Stephen. It is often said that the United States is today among the most religious nations on earth, with an unparalleled diversity of religions within our borders. This has come about through our belief in and the dynamic relationship between our fundamental American ideals and ideas like democracy, freedom, equality, and religion that have shaped our nation and its history since its earliest days. Religion has touched every aspect of American life, from culture and values to our political system. Whether one is a religious person or not, understanding religion's role in America is essential to understanding our shared future. In just 2 days, we will open our new wing to the American people, the nation we build together, one floor below us. The new floor is a response to the fundamental question that our country has wrestled with since our founding. What kind of a nation do we want to be? This floor will inspire the American people to embrace our common bonds, engage in our democracy, and shape a more humane future through 3 new Keystone exhibitions. American Democracy, A Great Leap of Faith, on the history of citizen participation, debate, and compromise is a real enticement to the American people to participate and engage in our democracy in the most comprehensive ways. Many Voices, One Nation, on the peopling of America, takes us on a 500-year journey on how we become us, how strangers become neighbors, embodying our national motto, E Pluribus Unum. And symbolically and physically linking these 2 exhibitions is Religion in Early America, which you will preview tonight. This jewel box exhibition explores the themes of diversity, freedom, and growth in America's religious tradition from the colonial era through the 1840s through an array of national treasures, both from our collection and from leading institutions across the country. The exhibition illuminates the diverse range of Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Native American, and African traditions that have been part of American life since our earliest days. So please come back often to participate in our many new programs exploring religion's fundamental role in American history, from music and theater to scholarly symposia and exhibitions. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Peter Manseau, our Lilly Endowment Curator of American Religious History. He's an acclaimed author and scholar with research interests that range from American Yiddish literature to Roman Catholicism. He's the curator of Religion in Early America and is the author of the accompanying book, Objects of Devotion. Peter.
Thank you, John, and welcome everyone to an event 4 centuries in the making. It's been my real honor to be involved in Religion in Early America for the past 2 years, and it's an honor I've shared with many people here in the museum, part of a wonderful team that has come together to work on Religion in Early America. Most especially my main conversation partner in the curation of the exhibit, our museum senior scholar, Dr. David Allison. Well, we have a special evening of music and conversation planned for you tonight. To provide some background on the exhibit you're here to see, and to suggest some new ways of thinking of its subject, we've organized tonight's program along the lines of two themes: objects and songs. We'll have the songs first in just a moment. You'll see we're all set up there for that. I will not be singing, sorry to disappoint you. And then following that, we'll have a conversation about the usefulness of using objects to study American religious history. But first, to explain a connection between these two themes, objects and songs, I wanted to begin by telling you briefly about just one object that you'll soon see in the Religion in Early America exhibit. This is the Bay Psalm Book. It's an edition of the Biblical Book of Psalms, published in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1640, making it the earliest book published in English North America. The Library of Congress has called it America's first book. It was the hymnal of the Puritans, the people from whom later generations of Americans learned to call this country a city upon a hill. This book was in many ways an inspiration for the Religion in Early America exhibit. When we found out that it would be available to display here at the museum a few years ago, we began thinking about the broader context in which a document like this should be displayed. We knew it gave us the opportunity to tell a larger story, a story concerned not just with Puritans, but all the other beliefs and practices that began to find a home here in the 17th century, as well as those beliefs and practices that had been here much longer than that. Religion in Early America was never the story of just one city upon a hill. From the beginning, it included many cities and many hills. In the decades surrounding the printing of this Puritan hymnal, the First Baptist Church in America was founded a little bit south in Rhode Island. The first Jews settled in New York. The first Catholics landed in Maryland. The first Quakers arrived in Pennsylvania. The first Anglican church was established in Virginia. And throughout the colonies, people that were brought here by force brought with them religious traditions of their own. One thing all of these groups had in common was that they all left objects behind. And they are all represented in Religion in Early America. Together, these objects illuminate beliefs and practices that might otherwise seem impossibly distant to understand. I'd like to suggest to you tonight that objects are particularly helpful for illuminating the past when you look upon them in three ways. First, objects were made. They are the work of human effort. The Puritans who created the Bay Psalm Book, they wanted to purify their religion. And so not long after they landed, a committee of 30 scholars got together and decided to create a new version of the biblical book of Psalms in keeping with their desire for a purer form of faith. And so they not only printed this book of Psalms here, they completed an entirely new translation. Considering objects as made in this way can give us a surprising insight into the personalities of their makers. As ambitious as the translators of the Bay Psalm Book were, they were also apparently a bit defensive about the quality of their final product. You can see this in their introduction to the Bay Psalm Book, in which they wrote, "If our verses here are not always so smooth and elegant as some may desire, let them consider that God's altar needs no polishing." The second way I'd ask you to consider objects tonight is this. The things you'll see in the exhibit were saved. We have them today only because they were carried forward through the centuries by generation after generation that understood their value. The copy of the Bay Psalm Book we have in Religion in Early America was owned by Boston's Old South Church for more than 250 years. Hidden within these objects is the care of individuals connected across the centuries by communities they hoped would outlive them. The final way I hope you'll consider objects, the objects you'll see tonight in Religion in Early America, is that they were used. This might be obvious, but when you pause to reflect on it, it can actually be quite moving. The Base Psalm book is today one of the most rare and valuable books in the world. But in 1640, they printed 1,700 copies. Why did they print so many? They did so because this was a book that was made to be held. It was a book made to have the corners of its pages turned down so you could find your favorite hymn. It was made to be annotated and to have handwritten notes written in the margins. Most importantly, it was made to be sung. It was used by men and women in challenging circumstances, struggling to live up to the words they prayed. As they sang psalms written in this new land, this new continent, their breath fell on these pages. There is no more direct connection to their hopes, their fears, or their faith. When you see the objects in Religion in Early America tonight, don't just think of them as treasures centuries old. They certainly are that. But I'd like you also to imagine the hands that held them, the communities that saved them, and the voices of those who used them. If you look closely and spend time in their presence, you may just hear the songs that these objects sing. On that note, it is my pleasure to introduce our first special guest tonight, Dr. Tim Erickson. Tim is a scholar of early American music, and he has traveled to be with us here today from the land of the Puritans. Tim is acclaimed for his startling interpretations of shape note singing and the camp revival tunes from the 18th and 19th century. Tim has taught this music at colleges including Dartmouth, Amherst, Wesleyan, and the University of Minnesota. And a few years ago, he even helped Hollywood get religion when the makers of the Civil War film Cold Mountain called upon Tim to teach the Australian Nicole Kidman and the Englishman Jude Law how to sing as if they were raised in an Appalachian church. Tonight, Tim will teach us to sing a little bit too. The revival songs he's chosen are mostly not quite as old as the Base Psalm book, but they are part of this same lineage of American religion remaking tradition. Please welcome Tim Erickson.
I'm going to try not to talk too much. There's a lot of awfully interesting stuff to be said about this exhibit and the connections with the music that I do. I'll try to hit on a couple of things, but really on that theme of connections is right up my alley. I'm just going to try to jump right into it and get some music in your ears before I run off at the mouth. Guide me, O thou great Jehovah. Pilgrim through this barren land. Yeah, hold on to that. I am weak, but thou art mighty. Hold me in thy powerful hand. Breath crystal fountain, whence thy healing waters flow. Let the fiery, cloudy pillar lead me on my journey through. Strong deliverer, strong deliverer, be thou still my strength and shield. I'm not going to say anything. I sang that out on the floor this afternoon. A woman came up to me, somewhat moved, and said her grandfather sang that same hymn and that same song not an hour and a half's drive from here. She hadn't heard it since she was a girl. And that was pretty neat. Talk about connections. A lot of these old songs, they're not just one thing. They become all kinds of things in the hands of different people. This is one that is kind of a convivial song in western New England. It's an older tune, but brand new words, circa 1798. Some of those words got changed about 20 years later. One of those words, actually, friendship, got changed to Jesus, and it became a hymn. We still sing it out of the Christian Harmony, Western North Carolina 7-shape book. But I've also, it was a march tune used by both sides, or the two big sides, during the American Revolutionary War. I was in England many years ago. Somebody said, "Oh yeah, that's a Morris dance tune." I heard it once I heard it once in church. So there was some kind of an arrangement for organ, and apparently somebody said it's by Haydn or Handel, or one of those German guys with white hair, white wigs. In any case, we call it Friendship. Friendship to every willing mind opens a heavenly treasure. There may the sons of sorrow find sources of real pleasure. See what employments men pursue, then you'll own my words are true. Friendship alone unfolds to view sources of real pleasure. False are the joys which fools esteem, fading and transitory. Mirth is as fleeting as a dream or a delusive story. Luxury leaves a sting behind, wounding the body and the mind. Only in friendship can we find pleasure and solid glory. Happy the man who has a friend formed by the God of nature. Well may he feel and recommend friendship by his creator. Then as our hands in friendship join, so that our social powers combine, ruled by a passion most divine, friendship for our creator. Thank you very much. I'm going to play one that you might have heard for various reasons. Perhaps you're Avett Brothers fans, or Bella Fleck. Doc Watson. There are two sets of texts that get most commonly used with this tune. It's a tune from the 1817 Kentucky Harmony. We still sing it today out of the Sacred Harp and other books. It's a song of great meaning, great beauty. I've sung it at way too many funerals. We used it in the film Cold Mountain, somewhat unintentionally. It's kind of a long story, but the Romanian army, if you've seen the film, it came out a number of years ago, begins with a big battle scene. 1,000 of those extras were members of the Romanian army, non-volunteers, 18, 19 years old. The Hollywood people had been told that Romania in August is 70 degrees and it never rains. It was 100 degrees and rainy every day for the first 3 weeks of shooting. And these kids, because of the property director's fastidious approach to costuming, they were wearing full, head-to-toe woolen outfits and getting their faces squashed in the mud. And they basically said, "We're out of here." The film's editor said, "We got to do something." They threw together a recording that we had done that wasn't going to be in the movie of this song with some of the footage of that they had shot, and they staged a screening for the soldiers so that they would see that this is actually going to happen and it's going to look cool. And then the director thought it was so effective they actually kept it in the movie. That's a kind of a contemporary pop culture reference, but a lot of other. I'm going to leave out one point of reference and see if it rings any bells. If it rings any bells from the late 1950s. Another connection to the. I'm talking. I knew this was going to happen. I'm so excited about the exhibit. Another connection to the exhibit. The last verse I'm going to sing is by Reverend John Leland from up in Heath, Mass, near where I'm from, a Baptist stronghold up in the hill towns. And you will see that he is known for having enlisted the farmers, local farmers up there to create was it 1,283 pounds? What was it? It was well over 1,000-pound wheel of Cheshire cheese, which was delivered by ox cart just down the road to Thomas Jefferson in the interest of the separation of church and state. As a Baptist, he was opposed to paying tax to pay for somebody else's preacher, and he apparently made an impact. He was an important figure in that whole circa 1804. I'll just sing this song. And am I born to die, to lay this body down, and must my trembling spirit fly into a world unknown, a land of deepest shade, unpierced by human thought, the dreary regions of the dead, where all things are forgot. Soon as from earth I go, what will become of me? Eternal happiness or woe must then my portion be. The day is past and gone, shades appear, oh, may we all remember well the night of death draws near. Does that ring a bell? Aretha Franklin, anyone? One of her earliest recordings. I'm not making that up. Here's one that's, if that wasn't familiar, this one certainly is. I've heard this called a black spiritual. I've heard it called a white spiritual. I've heard it called a folk song. I've heard it called a work song. What it is a Czech song. It wasn't translated into English until 29 years after the cutoff point for this exhibit. I can't sing it in Czech, but it was around. It's actually Moravian, a slight fib, but it brought tremendous comfort to people on both sides when our great Civil War erupted. If it sounds like African music, you're pretty much right. I am a poor wayfaring stranger while journeying through this world of woe. Yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go. I'm going there to see my father. I'm going there no more to roam. I'm only going over Jordan. I'm only going over home. I know dark clouds will gather o'er me. I know my ways rough and steep, yet beauteous fields lie just before me, where God's redeemed their vigils keep. I'm going there to see my mother. She said she'd meet me when I come. I'm only going over Jordan. I'm only going over home. I want to wear a crown of glory when I get home to that good land. I want to shout salvation's story in concert with the blood-washed band. I'm going there to meet my Savior, to sing His praise forevermore. I'm only going over Jordan. I'm only going over home. I am just going over home. The sacred and the secular are so fascinatingly and deeply connected in so many of these related traditions, these sacred music traditions. There's a lot of back and forth, and of course even with classical music, relations between classical and traditional and popular goes off in all directions. I was going to play you one that we call the Garden Hymn that we still sing out of the Sacred Harp. Fantastic example of the camp meeting hymns. In the interest of time, I'll just tell you that the title of the tune is "Piss Upon the Grass." It's a dance tune made into a hymn. I'll sing you another one that straddles the line, an 18th century song. Cold winter has come with his keen-cutting breath, and the verdure has dropped from the trees. All nature seems touched by the finger of death, and the streams are beginning to freeze. When the hills and the dales are all covered in white, and flora attends us no more. When you sit by your fireside, reviving and hot, will you grumble to think on the poor? When the north wind's descending and chilling the ground, and the huntsmen again shooting go, all the happy young lads on the rivers can glide, and the bridges are useful no more. When the lakes are all frozen by winter's cold breath, and the rivers congeal to the shore. When your bowl smokes with something reviving and hot, it's time to remember the poor. When the robin redbreast he is tracked through the woods, with his footsteps all banded in snow. And the robin redbreast he approaches your cot, and the icicles hang at the door. Soon the time it will come when our Savior will see, and the grave is triumphant no more. All the saints and the angels hallelujah will sing, and the rich will remember the poor. All the time it will come when our Savior will see, and the grave is triumphant no more. All the saints and the angels hallelujah will sing, and the rich will remember the poor. Thank you very much. Now, if you look at your programs, I was going to say if you turn to page 49 on the bottom, but I don't think your programs are that long. We call the shape note hymns by their numbers more than by their titles. Mere, reputed to be the first, the kind of the equivalent in a way of, wow, look at that. Never seen it that big before. Well, don't bother turning to your program then. It's kind of the sonic equivalent of the bass songbook in it being sort of the hymn of New England. It's the first notated piece of music, almost certainly written by a native English-speaking New Englander, 1720, thereabouts. It's been sung right down the line. Never stopped singing it. And it's a good one. It is Here, as we have it in the Sacred Harp, first appeared 1844, Western Georgia, very much a book that reflects that time and that place, that culture, but a lot of the songs are older. The older songs in the book are mostly from early New England, 1770s through about 1800, 1810, and then some arrangements of songs that had been in oral tradition, as well as newer songs, because this book has been in continuous print and continuous use since 1844, and the practice goes quite a bit deeper than that. So what you have here, if you haven't heard the term shape note music, this is what it is. The note heads have different shapes that represent what is still called the English solfege, although it was invented by an 18-year-old Irish guy in 1599. So the English solfege, you can find it in Shakespeare. Fa, sol, la, mi, fa, mi, la, sol, fa. Just your plain old major scale, but instead of do, re, mi, that was the Italian thing. There were French, of course, all across these parts. They had a different way of singing the scale, but within the sphere of British influence, people of African and European descent sang fa, sol, la, mi, fa, and native as well, Native American descent. It was the common way, at least in New England and kind of up and down the eastern seaboard. And so I'll give you the 42nd, the sort of elevator singing school. This lining out tradition from the Bay Psalm book became tremendously dear to people. The singing became very slow to the extent that people complained. There's one famous diary account of a woman recollecting when she was a kid in the late 17th century. The preacher called, "We'll sing Psalm 75 to the tune of Martyrs," and he realized he'd forgotten his sermon notes. He walked the mile to his house. He walked back, and they were still singing. Of course, they had all day, and they loved the music, so it wasn't necessarily a problem. But it became very fluid. People knew these songs so well, there was no sense of beat. And they introduced, in the 1720s, there was a movement starting in Boston to introduce what they called regulating the singing, regular singing. So let's do this. We'll establish a beat, and we'll all sing together on the same beat instead of in this big kind of open way that I did with that first song. If you go to a Sacred Harp singing, you will see people doing this. Some people makes them a little bit concerned about the nature of the event. It just seems a little cultish to see 20 or 30 people going like that. They're keeping time, as they have been since 1724. Now, of course, American culture, at least one aspect of it being what it is reputed to be, introducing that degree of order made some people pretty uncomfortable. And they said, who are you going to, that's too authoritarian for some people, to the extent they split churches over the music. You can't tell me when I'm going to sing that note. This is between me and God. Who are you, Who are you, the king? That's just only a slight exaggeration. Churches did split over the singing. But by and large, it got picked up. Singing schools became as probably the first youth music craze in the United States. 15, 16, 17-year-olds went nuts for this music all throughout the 18th century. Later on in the century, became more common for people to start writing their own music rather than importing stuff from England or from the Geneva Psalter. It became more and more common for people to start writing their own music, and then William Billings, and then we'll stop it there because it gets, you can just check out the exhibit. What I want to do is to show you how this works. Fa is triangular, sol is round, la is a rectangle. Mi doesn't happen too much, but it's the other one. It's a diamond. So I want to sing fa, sol, la, mi, fa. Can we do that? Fa, ready? Fa, sol, la, fa, sol, la, mi, fa. Fabulous. Well done. Now, this tune is on the third line. It's right here above verse. This is so convenient. There's probably even a pointer for this, but right above verse 5. I'm going to sing the tune. Some of you probably read music. If we had more time, we'd get you all doing it. But for now, I want to at least get the tune in your ears so some of us can sing it. And then the rest of you, if you want, we'll do that drone like we did in the beginning. I'll say a bit about that in a minute. All right. Fa, la, sol, fa. And do your best to sing it on the notes. Oh, and this is in 3 beats. 1, 2, 3. Another thing that split churches. Fa, 1, 2. Fa, sol, sol, la, fa, sol, la, sol, sol, la, fa, sol, sol, la, sol, sol, fa, la, sol, fa, sol, la, fa, sol, fa. There must be some plants or something. Maybe you guys all just sing this stuff. All right. Let's try doing that. And it's going to be a little tricky because, of course, the words will go, we have to be up there on the words and then still down here on the tune. Sing whatever part you want to grab. If it looks doable, we'll make a sound of it. And I have some friends in South Georgia around the Okefenokee who they use this song today still. And they grew up, I guess they're probably, well, my friend Johnny, who just passed away a few months ago, was about 80. But they were still doing it pretty actively when his kids, who are now about 60, were coming up. They'd get 4 people in the center of the room to sing the song on the 4 parts. They'd get a ring of about 8 people singing fa, walking clockwise. Oops, wrong way. Then they get a larger ring, maybe 15 people, so walking the other way, and then a huge ring. I was going fa, probably not that high, but and described it as being like a hive of bees. And it's true, we've done it. They taught us, and it's I guess it was a pedagogical tool. Anyway, let's just see if we can get a hive of bees going, and then I will turn it back over to Peter Manseau. Let's try that. Fa, sol, fa, sol, fa. Let's try it on the notes again. 1, 2. Fa, sol, sol, la, la, fa, sol, la, sol, sol, la, fa, sol, sol, la, sol, sol, fa, la, sol, fa, sol, la, sol, fa. Anyone that doesn't want to sing the tune, sing verse 1, 1, 2. Will God forever cast us off his wrath for elders full against the people of his love is little chosen flower. Verse 3, 1, 2. Where once thy churches prayed and sang, thy false profanely read, amidst thy gate, there as I sang, and there all
So that was the songs portion of the evening, and now we're going to move into our discussion of objects. Tim Erickson, what a tough act to follow. And so I should tell you now that we're following, but then Tim will come back, so that'll take a little bit of the pressure off. So we are honored now to be joined by two of the most prominent public scholars of religion in America working today. So I would like to call up Jenna Weissman Joselit and Stephen Prothero to join me on the stage, please. Welcome.
Wonderful to be here
Nice
and to
to be here.
sing.
Were you singing?
I was trying.
I stuck with the drone. Well, let me tell you who we have here joining us today. To my immediate left is Jenna Weissman Joselit. She's the Charles E. Smith Professor of Judaic Studies and Professor of History at George Washington University, where she also created and now directs 2 graduate programs in Jewish culture and the arts, which are the first of their kind in the country. Jenna is the author of many books, including The Wonders of America, which received the National Jewish Book Award in History. Her latest book, Set in Stone, America's Embrace of the Ten Commandments, was published just a few weeks ago, and it will be available for purchase and signing at the reception. In addition to teaching and writing, Dr. Joselit has enjoyed an active career as a museum curator and consultant. Her most recent exhibition, Shalom Bayis, Reflections on the American Jewish Home, is on view at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. That's actually where I learned my Yiddish, as it happens, and where Tim Erickson joins us from, in fact. So Amherst is well represented here today. So let's welcome Jenna. To Jenna's left is Dr. Stephen Prothero. He's the chair of the Department of Religion at Boston University and the author of books including the New York Times bestseller, Religious Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know and Doesn't, also available for purchase and signing at the reception. Dr. Prothero has commented on religion on hundreds of NPR programs and on television on all the major networks, and he was the chief academic advisor for the acclaimed PBS series, God in America. As John Gray mentioned earlier, Steve was a senior fellow here at the museum a few years ago, and he was instrumental in launching our Religion in America initiative and in intellectually framing the Religion in Early America exhibit. Let's please welcome Steve. I'm going to pass that to you. Well, I'd like to begin by asking you both about objects. As I mentioned, objects are the second theme of the evening. And people who work in museums and in universities, we sometimes refer to material culture. But we're really what we're talking about is stuff. The things that interact with human lives, often made, saved, and used by them, as someone once said. And
do we all have to quote you doing this?
And these objects, years later, can then become a lens on the lives that touched and were touched by them. So I'd be curious to hear from both of you if you could tell us about the role of objects in your own work as historians of American religion. The history of religion is so often seen as a history of ideas. What do we gain by also thinking about things? Jenna, if you could please start.
Start with this slide.
Sure.
So I knew Peter was going to ask me that question, so I prepared some remarks. So I don't know about you, but when the Ten Commandments have popped up now and again in conversation, I've tended to associate them with discipline and restraint, with accountability and the rule of law. Fixed in place and set in stone and nothing if not generously proportioned, even extravagant in scale, this divine constellation of do's and don'ts comes across forcibly and legibly as a social contract, a legal document, a proclamation. You can read these 10 commandments at a considerable distance, even when wet, allowed one observer of the round-top monument that calls the grounds of the Texas state capitol its home. When seen from that angle, the power, the resonance of the Ten Commandments resides in there being a text. Not any text, to be sure, but a text an orderly compilation of words, all the same. But somewhere along the line, while delving deeply into the imprint of the Ten Commandments on the American imagination, I began to think of them not so much as text, but as object, whose scale was more intimate than monumental, and whose context was more private than public. Thanks to that shift in perspective, which freed up the Ten Commandments, enabling them to circulate, the ancient biblical passages accrued an additional set of meanings. Consider, for instance, this set of 10 Commandments, which comes from the museum's holdings. It's fashioned out of wood. It's the handiwork of an anonymous folk artist who is more commonly associated with the prancing animals of a carousel than with sacred writ. And for years, it stood atop the Torah ark of a late 19th century Philadelphia synagogue. At the time, its well-intentioned jumble of visual elements, a Torah crown, a priestly hand gesture made familiar to many of you, thanks to Spock, hand-painted Hebrew letters, all set against the grain of a robust blue background, welcomed congregants. But then, as they grew more sophisticated and affluent, they outgrew their once humble, folksy surroundings, moving to new, more decorous and aesthetically restrained quarters. They left this 10 Commandments behind. Then again, there was nothing to stop them or you from carrying the 10 Commandments, or at least one of them, in your very own pocket. Vividly colored and endearing, this pretty little card, a testament to the printing innovation known as chromolithography, planted the 10 Commandments well within reach. So too did this bookmark, yet another treasure of the National Museum of American History. Hailing from the late 19th century, it's made of celluloid, or what we today know as plastic. On a narrow strip of the most up-to-date material of its time, the age-old biblical text looms large, a marvelous union of technology and tradition. But then that glorious rose atop the bookmark, looking as if it's just about ready to be plucked, also beckons. Those familiar with the language of flowers and its Christological associations would be right in seeing this particular rose as an expression of faith, or what our colleague Lee Schmidt calls floral piety. But you'd also be right were you to endow the flower with personal rather than religious meaning. The floral image of a rose atop the 10 Commandments hints at growth rather than stasis, at possibility rather than punishment. It domesticates the 10 Commandments and keeps them close. So too does this riotously busy poster, meant to be hung at home. It too was a state-of-the-art affair, awash in color, in saturated pinks and vibrant greens. It situated the 10 Commandments in a garden of flowers and branches. To gild the lily, cameos of ordinary people, some in ancient garb, others in modern dress, accompanied each commandment to illustrate its meaning. There's a lot to take in, but that's the point. Rich in human incident and in vibrant tale, this composition was at once an opportunity for storytelling and an exercise in visual expression. Like the floral bookmark, it brought the 10 Commandments down to earth, where they're softened, even feminized. The impact of its portrayal is felt more keenly still when you consider what's missing. A rock-ribbed Mount Sinai or a hardened Moses was nowhere to be seen. Even the presence of the stone tablets was muted. At one with their surroundings, they blended in rather than stood out. By stripping the 10 Commandments of their harsh, stony, patriarchal qualities and replacing them with a string of warm and familial associations, this particular chromolithograph suggested that the 10 Commandments had more to do with affirmation than with accountability. They, and other forms of material culture, are full of promise. Thank you.
Steve, the same question to you. You cover very different fields within American religious history, and yet you do both have this common interest in objects. How has it shown itself in your work?
I promise after I do my thing, we'll just chat, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So I did know as well that question was coming.
You don't always carry those notes with you?
No, or pictures up on the screen. So I wanted to start, when Peter asked me about objects, to come and think about objects, I wanted to start with this particular object because in the field of American studies and American history, material culture has been important since I was an undergrad, when I was a major in the late 70s and early 80s in American studies, and we were taught to do what we call then and call now material culture. And one of my assignments in a class was to write about an object, and I wrote about this object, which is an Eli Terry pillar and scroll clock. And I found it really fascinating that you could learn so much from an object, because I had thought of objects really as illustrations rather than things to think about as a scholar. And this particular clock, among the things that I learned as an undergraduate about American history through this clock, was that at the beginning of the 19th century, almost no one in the country had a clock. Why would you need a clock when what you were doing was getting up with the sun to work on your farm and putting your farm to bed when the sun went down at night? Clocks really weren't something people had until around the 1830s and the 1840s. And that's when the economy turned from agriculture to factories and to industrialization. And when you were working in a factory, you had to be there at 6 in the morning or whenever your shift would begin. And if you needed to catch the railroad, which now might come through your town, it came through on a schedule, and you needed to know what time it was. And so this presented an entrepreneurial opportunity to Eli Terry of Connecticut. And he started to make these clocks, which were the first mass-produced objects in American culture that used interchangeable parts. Before that, clocks were something that would be made by an artisan, and they would make them one at a time to order. These were made ahead of time. And they have a little bit of they're made for the middle class, but they have a little flourish of wealth with their fancy painting and their pillars and their the little metal flourishes on the top. So they might make you feel a little bit of an aristocrat, even as you're trying to make your way into middle-class life. And so as I was thinking about that object, I thought about a professor of mine in graduate school, my mentor, and who was in religious studies. And religious studies has been slower to get around to material culture. It's really been in about the last decade that we've started to think about this. But when I was in graduate school in the late 1980s, he was trying to get very hip with showing pictures in his lectures. And he really used them purely as illustration. It wasn't, he didn't use them as a way to think through the history. It would be, here's George Whitefield, here's a picture of George Whitefield, now I'll talk about George Whitefield. It wasn't, here's Whitefield's stand that we'll see downstairs. What does that tell us about him as a preacher? What does that tell us about the way he might have projected his voice, or the way people might have looked at him? And so he just showed slides. For those of you who are old enough to know, this is a slide projector. It's not something a lot of people use nowadays. But now we have this journal called Material Religion, and we think through these objects as scholars as evidence for us and the work that we might be doing in our own field. And in my own work, images have played a big part throughout my scholarly career. When I worked on this book on Asian religions in America, a documentary history, with my colleague Tom Tweed, one of the things that I argued in that book is that the adaptation of Buddhism in the United States, when Buddhism comes to the United States, it shifts and changes very much depending on the mode of transportation of Buddhism itself. We might say the distribution channel of Buddhism. And so if it comes through books, it looks a certain way. But if it comes through a teacher, a Buddhist teacher, it might look another way. And if it comes through art objects, it might look yet another way. So I started to think about the textual transmission of Buddhism in books, the interpersonal transmission of Buddhism in people, and the artifactual transmission of Buddhism through artifacts. So for example, here is a very important example of the textual transmission of Buddhism with Dwight Goddard, who was a Christian missionary who went in the late 19th century to China to convert the heathen, as he called them, and he ended up getting converted himself. He became a Buddhist. He came back to the United States. He founded probably the first Buddhist monastery in the United States, but being an American, he decided the monastery couldn't be in one place. It had to be in northern Vermont and southern California, and there had to be a van involved. And the Buddhist Brotherhood needed to go back and forth every year, 6 months at a time, because the Buddha had said, you should have no abiding place. You shouldn't stay too long in any one place. And so he became sort of America's original Dharma bum, and this book became a very important influence on Jack Kerouac, who found it in a San Jose library in the 1940s and set him on his career of his interest in Buddhism. Here was Swami Yogananda, who brought Hinduism to the United States in the 1830s at the Chicago World's Fair. And here's D.T. Suzuki, a Zen master, who did meet with the Buddhists, with the Beat Generation Buddhists, Jack Kerouac and others. But they really had already formed their understanding of Buddhism by reading books. And so their textual Buddhism was already firm enough in their minds that Suzuki really couldn't displace them, push them off the dime of where they had already begun. And then here's an image of artifactual Buddhism. The image is brought over by the so-called Boston Buddhists who visited Japan in the 1890s and 1880s. People like Ernest Fenollosa and William Sturgis Bigelow, who donated much of their collections to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which later set up these artifacts as a way for people to encounter Buddhism. And this is an extraordinary temple room that kind of feels like a temple when you go into it. It doesn't feel so much like a museum. And later in my career, I worked on this book, American Jesus. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to take a ride in that hot air balloon, but I hope to. I hope to someday. And for me, this project really began also with an image. I was working on the history of Buddhism and Hinduism in the United States. I was really uninterested entirely in Christianity. But when I went into the Hindu temple in San Francisco, the oldest Hindu temple in the United States, I found this picture. There was Jesus kind of haunting me, even as I was looking at Hindu images. And this is actually made by a Roman Catholic woman who was obviously influenced deeply by St. Francis of Assisi imagery in the Catholic tradition. But she was asked to do this image of Jesus, and so she did with Jesus in the half lotus position. He's not quite a good enough yogi to be in the full lotus position, but he is a yogi nonetheless. And then in my book, I looked at some of these other famous images. Warner Solomon, this is the most distributed image of Jesus in world history, head of Christ, 1940. Here's a kind of redo of that same image of Jesus as a kind of patriotic businessman. This is the favorite image of mine from the book. It's called Undefeated, and in case you don't know who that is, it says Savior on the left. This is part of a tradition of imaging Jesus as very masculine that is a response to earlier traditions that Jenna hinted at of the kind of feminization of piety where Jesus was expressed more as a woman. And here we have another image that was in my American Jesus book. There's a competition in the year 2000 of the best Jesus, the best new Jesus picture by the National Catholic Reporter. And this was done by a Vermont artist. Her name's Janet McKenzie, that I think is just wonderfully and intriguingly androgynous and a black Jesus, maybe a Native American Jesus, maybe a female Jesus that testifies to the diversity of images that we see in the exhibit downstairs, but also the diversity of understandings of Jesus in American history. So here's a way to think about American history also through objects, American religious history. This is from a church here in Washington, D.C., and I've lost my notes on this, but this is an image of the Last Supper with Marcus Garvey and Nelson Mandela and Louis Farrakhan, and Jesus as a very triumphant figure. This is just an individual pious person on a beach in California, and here's the Last Supper as a tattoo, and here's, I'm sure all of you have this. And all religions have versions of these, kind of what we would think of as kind of kitschy objects. When I was here working at the museum, I found a lunchbox of one of the Hindu gods. I forget which god it is, but it's downstairs in the bowels of the museum. So let me just end with this. One of the generous people who read my work from the very beginning when I first started writing books in the 1990s worked here at the museum. His name was Richard Alborn. And my very first book was a history of a biography of the first American to convert to Buddhism. It was called The White Buddhist. And it sold about 200 copies, almost all to libraries, and almost none of them have been read. But my mother read it, and another person who read it was Richard Alborn. And he wrote to me when I was in my first academic job, and he said, I'm at the Smithsonian, and I read your book, I really loved it, we should be in touch. And so we were in touch, and he then read my book, American Jesus, and after he read, and this is my last image, after he read my book, American Jesus, we engaged in an email conversation, and I just found this today, and it's apropos of this, what has happened with this exhibit, because he was saying, maybe we could do an exhibit at the museum about the American Jesus, based on your book. And, I barely had an academic job. I thought that would be cool, an exhibit on my book at the Smithsonian. And then he wrote back and said, well, actually, it wouldn't be that cool. And he said in this highlighted one, I doubt if the museum would ever take on such an exhibit subject due to the risk of baptism in political quicksand. So I love that the museum's willing to sink into a little quicksand, affirm or otherwise. And I'd just like to conclude on the note that there's a lot of ways to tell the story of American history. You can tell it through economics, through finance, through inventions, and through religion. And similarly, you can tell the story of American religion in a lot of different ways. One of them we learned today is through song. You can tell it through text, but you can tell it as well through objects. And I'm really glad to see the museum taking on this topic. And I think you'll find when you go downstairs, as I did, that this is probably the best exhibit in the history of the United States on religion in America. The objects that are down there are just astounding. So I hope you'll learn as much from it as I have. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, I invited you here both here to compliment me, so that's your job. No, really why I invited you both here is that I thought your work serves as a kind of bridge from the period that we're talking about in religion in early America to today. And it strikes me as interesting that two of the subjects you've both worked on quite a lot, the Ten Commandments and the figure of Jesus, they aren't present in religion in early America, at least as this exhibit presents them. And yet, we look at contemporary religion today and they seem ubiquitous. And it's hard to imagine a time in which the Ten Commandments as text, as objects, and the figure of Jesus and the face of Jesus were not a part of daily American life. And so I'm curious about the way we can use objects to tell the story of how these subjects and ideas we take for granted, how they become taken for granted. When do they enter into the conversation?
So we were chatting about this, and we thought we would ask you that question as well. There's something, I think, and please jump in, about the modernity of these images that is really compelling, and that underscores the perilousness, the anomie of modernity that then calls on a more concrete way to anchor oneself. So I don't think it's a coincidence that the popularity of Jesus and the attendant popularity of the Ten Commandments are post-Civil War phenomena, and that they reflect a kind of unsettledness in America that needs to be resolved through an affirmation of something that seems enduring and timeless. I don't know, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things when I worked on my Jesus book I was shocked by is I couldn't find any Jesus stuff in the early American period. And the argument that I made was that in the colonial and the early national period, so up through about 1830, so kind of in the period of this exhibit, the dominant way of thinking through Christianity was Calvinism. And the Calvinists read their Bibles from the back forward, and they really didn't get much past Matthew. So it really was Hebraic, a kind of Hebraic way of understanding Christianity. And in that model, which is about maximizing the power of God and minimizing the power of humans, this figure of a God-human who is bridging those two things doesn't make a lot of sense in the Calvinist world. And so the argument I made in my book was that the reason my book really starts in the 1830s isn't because I'm too lazy to look at the colonial and the early national period. It's really because, weirdly enough, people didn't care about Jesus. Christians didn't care about Jesus until around the 1830s, when Jesus starts to become your friend, the person to whom you've given your soul, the person you love, all that kind of stuff. Jesus is not a friend. It's a little bit like, more than half my students now talk about how their parents are their best friends, right? When I was young, parents weren't friends. There was no, right? So Jesus wasn't your friend in that period, and so he just wasn't a figure with whom you were really interacting. You were interacting with God the Father in the same way that we see in the Mormon tradition. It's really more about the verticality to God the Father. So I think one of the lessons, there's a kind of a hint in your question about kind of how do we tell that story, but I think the absence of the images in that case are telling that story. And I think with the Ten Commandments, part of what's going on is Americans start to get anxious about the moral fiber of America, right? I mean, that's the 20th century anxiety that, the Christian, secularity, Christianity is going away, the moral fiber is going away. If we pop some, Ten Commandments up in various places, then that'll fix things. So I don't think there was that anxiety in Puritan New England, certainly, that people didn't know the Ten Commandments and that people weren't following the Ten Commandments.
You mentioned in your book that you credit Thomas Jefferson as having something to do with the creation of this Jesus nation. Do you think Jefferson thought of Jesus as his friend?
No, he didn't. And but that's true. I mean, I do, right? Because Jefferson's Bible. Not to keep plugging, the exhibit, but I mean, it's downstairs.
That's why I asked you the question.
Amazingly, it's there. I have almost a half of a chapter on that Jefferson's Jesus, and the argument I make is that Jefferson really wasn't a Christian, but he was a Jesus lover. He was obsessed with Jesus. He thought of Jesus as an enlightened sage who might have written something like the Declaration of Independence, for example. And so Jesus was, a great moral teacher. He wasn't the sentimental savior that he becomes, later on in the 19th century.
Yeah. Jefferson's work, it seems to be, when you look at the Jefferson Bible, you'll see not only the book that Jefferson put together, but also a source book from which Jefferson carved passages from the New Testament with which he agreed and pasted them together. When you look at the source book, you see it's really a work of excavation. And I'm curious, Jenna, if you could tell us the story of the excavation of the Ten Commandments in the 1860s.
That was wonderful, Peter. Yes. So one of the discoveries, you think you know a lot of stuff, and then you follow this odd footnote, in a graduate student's dissertation that nobody other than the people working on the dissertation ever read. And there it was, apparently, and you probably don't know this, in the bosom of an Indian burial mound in central Ohio in 1860, there reposed a very, very, very ancient version of the Ten Commandments. Did you know that? No? Yes. So there's an archaeologist in central Ohio who insists that the mounds, those very immense mounds that festoon the landscape in Florida and Georgia and in central Ohio, were actually the handiwork of the ancient Israelites, the 10 lost tribes, and that somehow they passed on, talking about holding down to and retaining, they passed on this ancient 10 commandments that they had brought with them to the Native Americans, who then at some point in some kind of ceremonial act buried it deep in the mountains, in the bosom of an Indian burial mound. And then Mr. Wyrick, my job in life is to bring him back to life. He was a very dedicated amateur archaeologist who believed that in the so-called Jewish theory of the origins of Native Americans and of this country. And so he's so happy when he finds this object, which you too can see for yourself. It currently is part of the collection at the Johnson, I always get this wrong, Johnson Humbrick House, you try saying that, Johnson Humbrick House Museum in Coshocton, Ohio. So Mr. Wyrick exhumes this thing, and it causes a great stir on one face of the object, and it's carved out of a kind of indigenous stone to that part of the world. One part of it is what contemporary observers at the time likened to a truculent Moses, and on the other side is extremely ancient Hebrew writing that runs every way, up and down, in and out, up and down, around. And it turns out it's the text of the 10 Commandments, a little truncated and riddled with all sorts of spelling mistakes, but the 10 Commandments nonetheless. And so this occasioned a great hue and cry, and all sorts of folks in the emerging field of North American archaeology and ethnology began to study it, and they declare it an authentic relic of ancient America, and insist, and quite literally, that the 10 Commandments is a foundational document. Well, this was gold for me, absolutely gold for me. I had no idea that it existed, and it opened up a whole, at least a whole chapter of thought about the relationship of the land and of stone to America's sense of itself as the promised land. And so there's an entire chapter about the ways in which stone and landscape and earth figure in our understanding of the 10 Commandments, which you wouldn't think of when you think of the 10 Commandments. You just sort of think of them as these mighty, enduring stones, stelae. But it turns out that they have this really phenomenal history. And obviously, I mean, the punchline is obviously they're a hoax. Somebody planted them to fool Mr. Wyrick or to bedazzle the American imagination. There was another group at the same time also planting things. So it's very much in the air. But the work, the cultural work that this relic did, I think is really the heart of the story, that it provided Americans with a very tangible affirmation of their faith and with a connection to the old world. And as you all know, of course, America likes to see itself as the promised land. So here was a kind of tangible, it wasn't a proof text, really, of that relationship. And there's something both very innocent and touching and silly about it all in the same time, and it makes for one hell of a yarn.
Yes. You write in your book, in that chapter, I believe maybe you're quoting another scholar, but the wonderful line that stone loves story.
Yeah. So I have a wonderful, wonderful colleague named Jeffrey Cohn, who, among other things, is interested in monsters and in the inanimate and how the inanimate becomes the animate. And he's written a book recently called Stone, An Ecology of the Inhuman, in which it's kind of a tour de force. It's dazzling to think about stone, which, like the 10 Commandments, we think of as so inert and timeless and imperishable, as actually having a life. And his book came out just about the time that I was starting to write, and it's a wonderful example of how one colleague can inspire another to take their research in ways that it wouldn't have had I not thought about stone as something that's not quite pliable, but at least in this telling of tales about stone, very malleable.
I want to stay for just a moment on this word that you mentioned, hoax.
Yeah.
Another way of thinking about a hoax is an improvised reality, let's say. And it seems that there are many...
You're treading very close to false news here, right?
But there are many improvised realities in the history of American religion. I think specifically about the need to make new things. Most religious traditions, with the exception of Native American religious traditions in the American context are transplanted, or they're borrowing from many traditions and they arise in a new way. And so does that transplanted quality, does that create the need to make new things? And then does having all these new things that we've made, whether it's Paul Revere learns to become a church bell maker, or the translators of the Bay Psalm book want to remake scripture for their own purposes, having new things, does then that change the tradition going forward, or influence its capacity to change?
The short answer, yes. Yes, I mean, that's the beautiful story about religion and what you take away when you look at objects. My field in particular is history of the Jews, and clearly that story is one not only of persistence and resistance, but a continual process of self-invention or cultural invention, much of which fastens on things. But much of which also fastens on ideas, and I think that that's what keeps it sprightly and evergreen and renewable. It's a renewable source of energy. That ability to realize that religion isn't carved in stone or set in stone, but is pliable and lends itself to all sorts of interpretations.
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, there is built into most religious traditions a kind of veneer of permanence, right? Like, this is the Ancient of Days. This is, here's Jesus, and that's how Jesus has always been, right? Or here's the Ten Commandments, that's how they've always been. And yet, in very simplistic ways, things have to change, right? Jesus didn't speak English, for example, right? He probably spoke Aramaic. So if you're passing the Bible down into the United States, it has to be in English, and that involves newness and transformation, right? But similarly, if you're making an image of Jesus or an image of any other religious hero, people want to see themselves in that image, right? So when when Christianity goes to China and people start depicting Jesus, he looks like he's Chinese, right? When missionaries go to South Africa, he looks like he's South African. And so there's always this tension, and there's always challenges inside the tradition of like, no, you're going too far. You can't go there. You can only go here. And I think that plays out with text, and I think it plays out with objects. And I think that's sort of one of the grand tensions in religions in general as they move from one culture to another. As Buddhism moves from India to China, it has to shift because there isn't a begging tradition in China like there is in India, and that's the way Buddhist monks are getting fed, is by wandering around and begging in India. Well, they can't do that in China, so that the tradition has to change. And I think what happens in the US is that accelerates because we have an ideology of the new, that the new is good and the old is not good. And so in that context, there's a pressure to transform what is an ancient thing, and there's also a pressure to make new religions, which is what we see with Mormonism, for example, which is also on exhibit, downstairs. And so I think there's a lot of push from the old to the new in the United States, but that brings tensions too, that where people can't necessarily agree on the propriety of some of those shifts.
Right. I'm thinking also about the impact of the marketplace and the commodification of religion, which is a story that has engrossed historians enormously, and has fans and critics on both sides. So on one hand, it's a diminution, a kind of dumbing down, a corruption, a desacralization of religion. On the other hand, it gives it a new lease on life. It gives it wider circulation. It's fun to argue about these things. So I'm thinking, for example, in my context, of an action figure. That's a Moses action figure. It's really horrifying on a certain level. I mean, he comes with a so-called portable burning bush. He also comes... He comes with a so-called biblical bio. I kid you not, this is all off the websites of these things. And advertisers have even suggested that if you were going to hold a Passover Seder and you found that a little bit more boring, that this pint-sized action figure of Moses would actually banish ritual ennui from the Seder. So these claims are kind of ridiculous.
Or maybe a bigger Moses, too.
Bigger Moses.
A bigger Moses might even be better.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So on one hand, these are cringe-inducing moments. I mean, you think about Moses and the stature that he endures in so many religious traditions, and to see him reduced to 4.5 inches with joints that rotate in 16 different directions, and looking like Charlton Heston, there's something really to not be happy about. On the other hand, there's something really American and playful about it. So.
Just want to shift gears a little bit, and I would like you both to earn your keep as scholars by providing a little background information just for those about to view the exhibit. The three themes of the exhibit are religious diversity, religious freedom, and religious growth. And we talk about the way those factors contribute to each other through from the colonial period into the early republic. But religious diversity, as it was discussed in those periods, is very different from today. And so I was wondering if you could just set the scene of what did religious diversity in early America look like? How is it similar, and how is it different?
Your turn.
Yeah, I think on the one level, religious diversity was much narrower, right? There were no Buddhists to contend with. There were no Hindus to contend with, right? There weren't really atheists of great number to contend with, at least not really with much of a public voice. And so from our perspective, it can look like, squabbling among Protestant types, largely, right? Of the sort of, people fighting about what kind of music there might be in the church. So it kind of seems from us to like, what's the difference, right? But if you think about it in other ways, like, okay, who are the people your parents won't allow you to marry? I think in that sense, the diversity was even broader, right? And so if you were interested in a Lutheran and you were a Methodist, no, there's no way that could ever, happen. And so I think on one level, the diversity was much narrower from a kind of world religions course perspective. But in terms of a felt reality, where you had people who were much more devout than the average American today, where you didn't have 25% of Americans who claim no religious affiliation like they do now, where people really were willing to fight about religious concepts, I think the diversity was in many ways much broader.
And Jenna, the place of religious minorities?
Well, the Jews were quite the religious minority. They're kind of tiny, and the origins of the Jewish community in the U.S. Were not happy. Jews sort of landed here. It wasn't that they came searching for religious freedom, and that happened much later. So I think for the Jews, I'm thinking in particular of the settlement in New York, the awareness that there were many others was perhaps some measure of comfort. On the other hand, the many others still remained Christian. And that the prevailing ethos was that the Jews were to be contained as they had been in Europe. But little by little, that breaks down. And on paper, I think, increasingly, the possibility of neighborliness, the possibility of welcome. It wasn't quite instituted yet. It was more of an ideal than a lived reality. But it was within reach. And I think that was a wonderful tonic and a balm to American Jews, even though they could not hold office in certain places and they couldn't be buried in certain cemeteries. The idea that perhaps down the pike, somewhere along the line, things might open up because there were no formal governmental strictures. There was no established church, per se. I think that afforded them, on a psychological level, a sense of possibility here, certainly when contrasted at the time with what was going on in Europe, which was horrific for the Jews. Well, I mean, what do you think? I mean, you've studied this population. Would you agree, or...?
Oh,
I wasn't supposed to do that? No. I thought we were having a conversation.
Well, I do want to get your thoughts on my final question. As two scholars of American religious history who have spent a lot of time thinking about objects, I am curious to know what we should include in an exhibit 200 years from now on religion in America early in the 21st century.
I don't have a clue. I say to people, I get these questions all the time, like, how would you predict? And I say, I'm marvelous at predicting the past. I'm really a whiz at that. But when it comes to the future, I really don't have a clue. And I think, on one hand, there's the amount of stuff that we have is so dramatic. On the other hand, the digitization and the technologization of this culture results in things that are so evanescent. You know, I don't know. I don't know.
Tweets.
Tweets.
Seriously, I mean, I think that, historians are now worried about, we used to have letters,
Right.
and we don't have letters. Nobody writes letters anymore. So that's a major source for historians. And similarly, the kinds of records that churches used to keep. I have a friend who still goes to New England churches and goes down in the basements and he finds amazing things about colonial religion. So I think digital stuff, emails, tweets. I think that kind of stuff needs to be collected, and it's hard to know really how to sift through that. YouTube videos. I mean, what are the things that It's interesting to me when I started teaching. I used to be able to talk about television shows when you didn't have this explosion yet of cable. And so the TV show Friends, for example, that those of you who are over 40 will remember that show. That show I could talk about in a class, and I could say, oh, last night, where you all saw Friends, blah, 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 and say something about it. You can't do that anymore with any television show. And you can't do that with any movie. The culture is so much more pluralistic and fragmented. But there are certain viral videos that actually have that currency, that you can talk about it. I don't know. My students have all seen the double rainbow, the triple rainbow YouTube video. That's something that for people under 30, half of Americans have seen. And so I think that's another thing is, viral video images that are just kind of earworms in people's minds. Those are the kinds of things that are sort of powerful images that might look something like, an image of Jesus in the 1850s or something.
Or maybe music. I would like to think that music is one of those things. It's a form of expressive culture that will continue to hold us in its sway.
Yes. And with that,
Oh, good.
I would like to thank you, Jenna, Weissman, Joselit, and Stephen
you.
Prothero. Thank you so much for having us
Thank
come
you.
to stage. Thank you. You can stay or you can sit. You can stay. And now, before we allow you to go downstairs, enjoy the reception, and to preview Religion in Early America, we're going to invite Tim Erickson back up to the stage. We will stay behind him, but we will not be his backup singers. I should say also that we do not have tweets or cat videos in the exhibit, but we do have many animals, and so you should all look and see how many animals you can count in Religion in Early America.
Well, I'm glad I didn't have to wait 200 years to be part of this exhibit. Figured it would be appropriate to end with a song about the end of the world. This is an Afro-Celtic gospel song from the state of Maine about the failed apocalypse of 1843-44. Although I was corrected once by a table of Baha'i in Stirling, Scotland, if there's any Baha'i representing tonight. You can look it up later on if you don't know what I'm talking about. In the meantime, you can sing the chorus. Gabriel's going to blow from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's going to blow by and by. Gabriel's going to blow from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's going to blow by and by. You see the judge descending. Oh, you see the judge descending on that great day. Oh, Gabriel's going to blow from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's going to blow by and by. Oh, you see the dead are rising, rising, rising. Well, you see, the dead are rising on that great day. Oh, Gabriel's going to blow from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's going to blow by and by. Oh, the stars will be falling, falling, falling. Oh, the stars will be falling on that great day. Oh, Gabriel's going to blow from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's going to blow by and by. And the moon will be a bleeding, bleeding, bleeding. Oh, the moon will be a bleeding on that great day. Oh, Gabriel's going to blow from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow by and by. Sisters, are you ready, ready, ready? Oh, sisters, are you ready for that great day? Oh, Gabriel's going to blow from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's going to blow by and by. Oh, brothers, are you ready? Ready, ready. Oh, brothers, are you ready for that great day? Oh, Gabriel's going to blow from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow by and by. May we all sing together, together, together. Lord, may we all sing together on that great day. Oh, Gabriel's going to blow from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's going to blow by and by. And may the circle be unbroken, unbroken, unbroken. Lord, may the circle remain unbroken on that great day. Oh, Gabriel's going to blow from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow by and by. Oh, Gabriel's going to blow from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's going to blow by and by. Oh, Gabriel's going to blow from on high, from on high. Oh, Gabriel's gonna blow by and by. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. And now, everyone, please join us one level down for the exhibit and the reception. Thank you so much.